has a pretty simple title, Go. It's an active word, one that we are called to do in many different aspects and in many different ways. About 5 weeks ago, I married Cody and Brittany here in the church, and for several weeks prior to that, we had counseling sessions, and we visited and talked about how life was going to change as a married couple compared to what they were used to up until that point. The two of them were going to be leaving the safety nests of their parents, of their friends, and coming together to become a new couple. Now, while the family and friends were still going to be close, and they were going to be there and available for support and for help, it still doesn't change the fact that these two are going to be going through an experience that they haven't had before. Compromising personal desires out of love for the other. And in that decision, in that call to get married, there is no guarantee within that venture that everything will go well. There's no guarantee that it's going to turn out. It is a step of faith. How is God calling you? Tonight, as we gather this last night of 2013 and we kind of look forward to the excitement of a new year, changing the page on the calendar, I'm curious as to how you feel God calling you as we enter this new chapter in life. We have this faith thing that we read about, that we come and listen to sermons about, that we sing about and worship, but how is it affecting you in your daily life? God's calling in our lives is not something of complacency or comfort. Calling is something of action. We are called to action. And so what purpose have you been created for? What action are you planning to take in this new year? What gifts, what skills, what talents do you have? What convictions, what passions do you have that you're going to allow to bubble up to the surface, that God has planted in you, uniquely yours, in which you will be called to action? Our calling is more than just a job. It's like a thread going through a sweater that is connected to our personal lives, is connected to our relationships, is connected to our spare time as well as our jobs. It is our convictions, our deep sense of commitments that you can't describe in words, but yet you feel passionate about. It will show up in your personality. It'll show up in your conversations, in your work ethic, in your family dynamics, and in your work. So are you following your calling? And I don't believe that everyone has one calling from birth that goes straight on through till death. I do believe that callings can change. But are you following your calling? Or have we put our passions, our convictions, our commitments on the back burner in order to do something that might make more money, that might be more acceptable to our family and to our friends? Are we living the purpose that God has given to us? Abraham and Sarah were in their 90s when God called them to pick up from their families, to leave, to start a family. To start a family, in their 90s. Wow. Talk about stretching in comfort zones, huh? I think so. God called them out of their place, out of their comfort zones, and Abraham listened. And he went. He put his own desires on the back burner to follow God's calling. He very easily could have said, "No way, God. I've put in a long enough life. I've worked hard enough. It's time to retire. Thank you, but no thanks." Instead, Abraham and Sarah followed this calling, and their life was changed forever. They raised a family. They seeded generations upon generations of people who were to come upon this earth. It wasn't easy. It wasn't convenient. It was God's calling. And they followed. And when they followed, they were blessed in abundance. Moses had been in slavery in Egypt for years. And during a confrontation with an Egyptian guard, he killed a man and then fled for his life to a country far away and became a shepherd, where he shepherded in the wilderness for years. Comfortable and safe from any harm. And then one day, while he was out doing his shepherd's work, he saw a burning bush. And his life changed forever. As suddenly God's call to Moses was to go back to Egypt and to lead the Israelites out of that nation who have been in slavery and in bondage for 400 years. Who? Moses? A lowly, low-class shepherd who had a reputation already, a rap sheet, if you will, for murder, who had a stuttering problem, and he said to God, "You're going to ask me to go to one of the most powerful men in the world, challenge that man, and take these Israelites away?" And God said, "Yes." And he came up with more excuses, and more excuses, and more excuses, and more excuses, and God kept showing him ways to overcome those excuses before finally Moses said, "Okay, I'll go." How often do we make excuses for the things that we're feeling called to do because it's out of our comfort zones? And yet God has promised, if you are doing what I am calling you to do, I will provide for you, and I will provide abundantly. In today's gospel text, Joseph had a dream that an angel told him to escape into Egypt. Herod was a ruthless killer. And it was known that he was a ruthless killer. He killed his own sons out of insecurity that they could end up taking over his kingdom at some point in time. And so when he heard about this newborn king, he sent out his armies to kill every child within 2 years and under to make sure Jesus was killed. God didn't stop the murder. The sin continued. But God did save his son. He did allow them to go to Egypt. And once Herod died, the angel came back in a dream and said, "You can go back home now." See, Jesus was not allowed to stay in that safe place. He could have been raised there in Egypt. He could have lived there without any question of harm. But they were called back to Israel. And you know the story of Jesus as well as anybody else does. His life was far from easy. He was challenged, he was persecuted, he was killed in the name of the Father. He followed his calling. So how is God calling you today, tonight, in this place? What sparks your curiosity, your intrigue? What lights your passion? What interests have you had that you always kind of put in the bag, but you would really like to be doing something with it? Unfortunately, we've succumbed to the thought in our culture that the entire purpose and meaning of life is related to financial security. Our culture basically believes that from the time that we are born, our basic purpose is to earn enough that when we die, we've got something to give us an inheritance. Is that God's calling? How many of us go through day after day after day working to provide without appreciating what's going on in our lives at that point in time? How often I've talked to people in assisted living communities who have talked about the regret in their later years of not spending more time with family, not pursuing things that they felt passion for, because they felt it was more important to be earning their savings in their retirements. Were we simply created to be earning for the end of our life? Are we letting our lives pass by? All focused on the end and missing out on all of this time in between? What a cold, lonely, and selfish existence, if that's the case. And by the way, I can attest to that. For several years, that was my focus as well. Life is bigger than the person that stares back at you in the mirror. And for that matter, are we able to look into the eyes of the person who's looking back to us in the mirror? Are you able to recognize the difference between what you want to be and who you really are? Can we face imperfection and accept it? Knowing that God created you just as you are, loves you, forgives you, and wants you to prosper. He wants us to live abundantly. But God's definition of abundance isn't the same as ours. We tend to want to equate abundance with big bank accounts, with stuff. Big house, new car, 401k, pension, savings, you name it. God is not talking about a big house and a new car. Abraham never owned any land. His family had to scrape the bottom in order to be able to buy a plot for him to be buried on, and yet he was blessed with the promises of God, of generations that would follow him. Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, went through the wilderness. For 40 years they went in a circle in the wilderness until they finally get to the promised land, which was the whole reason for his bringing people out, and he didn't get to cross over. God allowed him to stand in a mountain and look over the land, and then he died. But he was blessed. Joseph, he was basically a forgotten character in Scripture after the birth story. But do you think he was blessed beyond measure to be the earthly father of the Son of God. As we enter a new calendar year, it's really important that we get real. I mean, get real with ourselves. That means taking the time to learn the difference between who we are and who we want to be, individually, as a faith community, and as a larger community. Getting real with ourselves means acknowledging that we are nothing without God. We are created to be good stewards of God's creation, of God's possessions, not ours. It means spending more time thanking God for our blessings and asking God for forgiveness, because each and every one of us are sinners in need of God's grace every single day. There's not a one of us that is any better or any more worthy than anyone else out there on the planet. It's time that we quit making excuses for our callings, for the gifts and the talents that we've been given. It's time to see that every time we make an excuse, God can one-up us with possibilities. Beginning tonight, let's share handshakes and hugs with our neighbors, even those who disagree with us. Recognizing that they're in the same boat of life that we are, with fears and with dreams. And rather than telling them that their fears and or dreams are wrong, let's help build each other up and support each other with the gifts that God has given us, even if they're different. Moving forward, let's commit to giving credit where credit is due. Trusting the one that provides everything that we need in abundance. Responsibly managing God's creation and possessions, and faithfully and joyfully giving to God what is His. In closing, hear the words of the prophet Jeremiah. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. That hope and that future is in Jesus Christ. Nothing that we can do will bring that hope and that love and that forgiveness that only comes through the Son of God. God bless you tonight.